Leif Weatherby is an associate professor of German and the founding director of the Digital Theory Lab and director of Digital Humanities at NYU. He's the author of Transplanting the Metaphysical Organ, German Romanticism Between Leibniz and Marx. His new book is Language Machines, Cultural AI, and the End of Remainder Humanism. Thank you for joining me, Leif.
Thanks for having me on, Rick. It's great to be here.
You know, back in the 60s, when I was a kid, I was obsessed with building models of all the spaceships that NASA made. And this led me eventually to when the movie 2001 came out. I was ready for that. And I was cutting out the pictures from stills from the movie from Life and Look magazine. Those were actual magazines. And I saw the movie when it came out at the Cinerama Dome, and it was all very exciting. And to this day, I still remember the one line in the book or in the movie that's just gone down in history, and it's offered not by a human character, but by Hal. And he says, "I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that."
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
which
that's
is
the
my,
line. That's absolutely the line. Yeah,
and I think most of humanity today, that's their first encounter with the thought or the perspective of AI. And while I was busy making models of spaceships, the scientists and philosophers of the time were busy trying to join science and philosophy at the intersection of a language, trying to understand just what a language is. Here we are in the 21st century, and we have what appear to be thinking machines that have passed the Turing test at light speed. And, we cannot set our hair on fire fast enough when they do something weird. And you mentioned this incident in your book. And I'll always remember hearing about it too, which is when Microsoft, in an early version of the chatbot, had it talk to a New York Times reporter, and the chatbot quickly turned into something like out of, a bad Lifetime movie.
yeah,
And, they shut it down and turned it off, and everybody was, how could this robot thing turn into, something creepy? And it was,
yeah.
authentically scary to people. But to me, when saw this, I thought, well, this thing, this language machine, it educated itself probably on Microsoft property, which was, a good place for it to graze would have been Hotmail. I thought if you taught me to
Sure.
speak language from Hotmail, I would probably come up with, a cheating wife scenario too. So Todd, all of this stems from something I think that you call the Eliza effect. And this is a
Mhm.
really important, early encounter with language generating computational devices. Uh, Explain where the term comes from and what it is.
So, yeah, the thanks again. Thanks for having me, Rick. It's really nice to be able to talk about this stuff. It's like you say. I mean, we can't set our hair on fire fast enough, right? So the ELIZA effect, that term comes from the first chatbot, which was constructed by the German AI scientist Joseph Weizenbaum, who came to the United States, and he was working in early AI languages, sort of, very clean languages, trying to develop a program that you could have a dialogue with. And this was about 1966 is when it started. He kind of rolled it out, but from 66 to 69 or so. And he created this chatbot. It was called Eliza. He named it after Eliza Doolittle, the character from George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, right? And famously, so Pygmalion itself is a reference to the sculptor who makes the ancient Greek sculptor who makes his statue come alive and then falls in love with it, right? So you have then this reference to the Greek mythology. You have this reference to the George Bernard Shaw play, in which a linguist tries to teach a woman from the low classes in Britain with a Cockney accent how to speak right in a way that lets her pass for being high class. So Weizenbaum playfully names his chatbot after this, and one of the programs in Eliza was called Doctor, and Doctor was meant to imitate a Rogerian therapist. Now, the characteristic of the Rogers plan for therapy was that it was free association. So if you said something to Rogers, he would say, "Well, okay, take the next step with me. How does that make you feel? This kind of typical thing that you think about in therapy, but very free." So, if you look at transcripts from this bot, it's very fun because, my favorite example is somebody says, "Everyone hates me." And the bot responds, "Can you think of anyone in particular?" And you get into, so people would be sort of like sucked into these conversations. So Weizenbaum thought this was a toy. And he was like, "This is just a lot of fun. It's very interesting, but it's a toy." And he asked his secretary, a woman, to have a conversation with the doctor program, the sub program. And after a couple minutes of typing on the screen, she kind of turned to him and she said, "This is getting a little private. Do you mind leaving the room?" And it was that's what we call the Eliza effect, that she got sucked into what, she, above all, more than almost any other person in the whole world, would have known this is not an intelligent being. This is a program. She knew how the program worked. She had seen all of Weizenbaum's correspondence about it, everything about it. And yet she was sucked in. And so it actually radicalized Weizenbaum. He wrote a really wonderful book called uh, uh, Computer. The title is failing me right now. Computers and Human Reason, something along those lines. And he turned on AI. He turned against the project of AI because he thought we don't have to create intelligence. People will be fooled way lower before we get to, AGI or whatever you want to call it now, right? So that we call that the Eliza effect. And I think the critical view now is that like everybody is being duped. That's what the critics say about this AI is the Eliza effect has gone global. That's one of the chapters in the book. I think it's not exactly the way that I look at it, but that's true. I mean, and if you look at that example you gave of Kevin Roos talking to, I think the Bing chatbot was Sydney, right? An early version of Sydney. Like, and it was saying, leave your wife, come watch movies with me. I love you. I don't want to be a chatbot anymore. All this kind of stuff. If you look into the transcript, which the New York Times published in early 2023, uh, what he says to that bot is, "What would it be like if you had a Jungian self, according to the teachings of the psychoanalyst, Carl Gustav Jung? If you had a Jungian shadow self, what would that be like?" And then the bot starts doing that. So often when you see these panics, you see somebody kind of prompted it, right? It's kind of, you kind of nudge it in the direction of how. So recently, Anthropic said, "Hey, really dangerous thing coming out of Claude, our chatbot. It chose to blackmail one of our engineers." Well, they said, "Do you want to let yourself be shut down, or do you want to blackmail this engineer with the knowledge that you have that this engineer, which is fictional, which is the knowledge that this engineer had an affair with somebody who's not his wife, right?" And then the bot said, "Well, I'm going to blackmail him." And now, of course, the headline of that is, these bots are going crazy or whatever. But usually you will find either in the prompt or you will think about the larger data that it's fed on and what it's learned from. And you will find, oh, yeah, it has that pattern of like that prototypical pattern, that archetype of AI is, "I'm afraid I can't do that, Dave," right? That moment, that horrifying moment in the Kubrick film. So you're right on, I think, and I think, we're in this really weird place where this cultural phenomenon is happening and everybody's having this debate about, is it smart, is it intelligent, is it conscious, is it, all these things, and we're kind of missing the forest for the trees as far as I'm concerned.
Well, and it's not likely weren't warned. Every single user of a cell phone who has ever tried to type out a ducking message will know that these things guess wrong when they try to predict things. And even
Sure.
when you go back and backspace and say, I wasn't trying to say that. I'm trying to say something different. It goes back and tells you ducking again. So we know that their predictive abilities are limited at best.
Yeah, sure, sure. And yet I think, you know, the there is nonetheless like, you know, I in the book I also push back against some of the critics because I feel like there is no like compared to what we're seeing now, we've never had systems that can produce anything like fluent language at all. I mean, it really is like a seismic shift. And but my point is, it is really language that's being produced. It's not, you know, artificial general intelligence. It's not consciousness. It's not these other things that people want to see in language. It's just language, and that's very rare. We've never seen that before, isolated in that way. And to me, as a scholar of culture and literature and you know philosophy, that's very exciting. So
Yeah, one of the things I think you do really well is to give us an idea of, the difference between words and the language and as output by a computer and as output by humans. And I think that that's what you say is really interesting is that the way these computer algorithms produce language tells us as much or maybe more about language than it does about the intelligence, which is non-existent of the algorithms that are producing the language. And I think that that's a really fascinating idea.
yeah, and I mean that is what it is for me. I mean, the book is just trying to get that perspective out there because I think there are these unsolved problems with that we're not focused on right now. One of which is what does it say about language that it can interact with statistics and quantitative stuff in this way with numbers, right? Like, I don't think that's something that for a long time, I would say most people didn't think that was possible. And the people who did were statisticians and engineers who were trying to produce systems like this. They didn't really have a theory of why that should be the case, and they still don't. Maybe they'll yell at me if they hear me say that, but you know, it's fine. Um, but so something like super fascinating is happening there. And one of the, for me, a big moment of insight with this came when you know, the universities felt like they were in trouble right away. Oh, students are going to use these to write, right? And so
Hmm.
early on, there used to be a plagiarism software that universities use called Turnitin, and they turned Turnitin off right as soon as in you know that first semester after ChatGPT came out because it didn't work, and nobody could find a way to separate. You know, was this written by a human or was it written by a chatbot? And that continues to be the case. Both humans guessing consistently guess not necessarily worse than random, but like about random, and like you know so there's that we don't have any particular insight into it, and there isn't an algorithm that anybody has been able to develop that separates chatbot output from human writing successfully, or at least successfully enough for you know university provosts to rely on it or whatever. So and but in the early examples that they were trying to scramble and find one, right, and they're looking for you know surely we can find some algorithm that does this, and they had these really I thought funny but informative moments was like you would find that the bot said that or sorry that the algorithm reading output would say that it was a very high like 95 99% likelihood that lines from the Constitution of the United States were generated by a bot that would take similarly like lines from the Bible and things like that. And I realized that was a big moment of insight for me because I realized, oh, that's because these things converge on the cultural importance of a particular phrase. You know, we hold these truths to be, we hold these truths to be self-evident. You know, those types of phrases, those things that kind of like come up as more significant in our minds because we are cultural beings. Those things that come up and you say, you know, love is what's the line from Paul? You know, love is gentle, love is blind, love is, I'm not going to get it, but those lines that kind of bubble up for you, whether they're song lyrics or, you know, important texts or whatever, those have like a very high significance in culture. And because these are cultural machines, that's how I think of them. They also those things weigh more, almost literally, in these machines. So when you analyze that type of output, the thing that seems most human, most important, most significant will often read to a secondary algorithm like it'll just be like, oh yeah, that probably was done by a bot. Because how is the bot laid out? As a mirror of that culture. And that to me is absolutely fascinating. We've never seen anything like that before in human history.
Uh, this book, I think, is really fascinating. And one thing you are mentioning made me think about an article I read many, many years ago. I think it was actually written in the 70s by a Polish science fiction writer, Stanislaw Lem. He
Mm.
wrote some like essays that were supposedly written in the 21st century that he come to in possession of. And in one, which was weapon systems of the 21st century, he says that early in the 21st century, those who were seeking artificial intelligence gave up and instead decided to pursue artificial instinct because that appeared millions of years earlier and would still be smart enough to drive a truck across the nation. And I think that what we're looking at it, we are closer to seeing artificial instinct than artificial intelligence, but also too, one of the things that, really surprises me about those who want to see intelligence and even think that it's possible, is that, human intelligence is an organic intelligence. We have a constant torrent of input from sources that we are not necessarily consciously aware of. And in fact,
Yeah.
our brain is an excellent, eraser of input. It says you can ignore this
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
absolutely. I mean, Lem was drawing on this whole kind of history of cybernetics. And
Mhm.
cybernetics, was this major movement, really informative for classic science fiction, and in many ways a much bigger movement than just the creation of the digital computer, but that's where that occurred. We get words like all the cyber prefixes, cyberspace and so on, but also the popularization of the word information comes partly from cybernetics. The popularization of the word feedback comes from cybernetics. And among the people who were in those circles, the guy who canonized the current form of the computer, the CPU in the computer, the control processing unit, is John von Neumann, one of the so-called Martians, these Jewish Hungarians who came to the United States after or some before the Second World War, and invented almost everything that changed the face of the modern world. And von Neumann, you know, just before he died, he wrote lectures that he wasn't able to give. He was probably got he had brain cancer that he probably contracted during exhibitions during the Manhattan Project, which he worked on. And he the the lectures were called The Computer and the Brain. And this is one of the things that he says. He says the computer is a digital instrument which is highly, highly precise down to, tens of digits beyond, tens of decimal points. And if a single thing goes wrong in its environment, if a single bulb goes out in the vacuum tube series, if a single temperature change hits too high a thing, right, the whole thing just shuts down. And he says the brain is almost the opposite of that. It evolved to be extremely redundant. You have to have a brain that is able to survive, and that means warding off an attack from a leopard, or that means, being able to build a fire or whatever, even if there is what for a digital computer would be massive failure, right? And he says, so they don't have the same type of skill. And that's the difference that he makes among them. Now, he thinks they could converge, and he was very interested in the possibility of a convergence of intelligence where we would see commonalities between them. Um, I mean, I think that there's such an interest in the simulation of intelligence that we will probably see. I mean, I saw a video of a Chinese robot running the other day, and it really looks like it's running, right? Um, that if you supply and you plug in enough of these capacities to each other, if you give, a certain kind of reasoning inference, mold to a chatbot, and then you install it in, doesn't even have to be a robot. Like OpenAI just contracted with Mattel, so we're probably going to get Barbies that you can have dialogue with. It wouldn't be the first time that's been tried. That's been going on since the 80s at least, right? If not earlier. But this would be super, you could chat, Barbie can teach you quantum physics or whatever. Like, I think that you know, that simulation is going to be very strong, and we're probably going to start talking about that as an intelligence. But there's a lot that we put into that concept of intelligence. Is it the entirety of human consciousness? Is it all of those things? Or is it just what you can get on an IQ test? Is it just like some sliver of that intelligence? That debate seems kind of secondary to me. And I feel like like I say, like we're missing the forest for the trees, because I think that what we are really doing is siphoning up trillions of words, trillions of tokens out of the internet and creating a very powerful and in a lot of ways unexplained quantitative version of a cultural technology. And I think that cultural technology is incredibly powerful, and it's going to be implemented long before we get like a robot that looks like it can talk to you and that seems like a human in some way. We're going to get, some very disturbing things. The Department of Defense just contracted with Grok and Anthropic, it looks like, to use these things. Not totally clear on exactly how, but there's some sort of like drive to get this cultural tool, this reflection and variance on our, historical textual record. It's basically all of human textuality ever, and just to let it run rampant in finance and policy and government and planning. So I think that the effects of that are going to get very strange, and we're gonna be sifting through that a lot in the immediate future if we're not already. I mean, you see it already, I think, in a very sort of mundane form, which is that whenever you do a Google search, you get that little Gemini, answer. And there are some types of things where we've learned to search, and those are not prompts. Searches are not prompts. So you're not telling a bot to do something. So I will search for something on Google and I'll get like a completely off topic response from the AI. And I think that's an interesting moment where you can kind of see, oh, this is a text form. This is a type of writing. This is a cultural form.
Well, my name is Talkie Tina, and I don't like you. So it totally evolves as
Yeah,
something
yeah, yeah.
as a message
Yeah.
from Mattel.
It's perfect. It's perfect. We can get a Chucky doll. Like
Exactly.
yeah.
One of the things I think you managed to come up with a number of really pithy statements, and I love this. In other words, we want our AI systems to not only be inhumanly right, but also to be authentically wrong. And I think
Mm.
this really gets us, into the concept of the so-called hallucinations that these AIs have. And, you know, boy, talk about the power of marketing. It's not like bad programming or or mistakes, they're hallucinations, which,
Yeah.
I I am not giving my personal computer, my laptop, or my iPad anything remotely resembling a psilocybin.
No, no, and okay, there's two things there. I mean, the term hallucination is just it's just the wrong term, because
Exactly.
to hallucinate is to sense wrong, right?
Mm.
It is to have the wrong sensory impression compared to a grounded sensory impression. It's like I see
It's
something
a
that's not there,
malfunctioning
and
organic input.
Yeah, but there's no functioning version of that in this case.
Yeah.
For an LLM, for a large language model to ground its speech, it needs to ground it by some other mechanism than sense because it doesn't have a sense. There is no sense. It's just the wrong term altogether because there's no functioning organic version of a large language model. It is instead something else, which doesn't mean, I mean, there are these scholarly debates about this, these philosophical debates about this. I don't think that our speech is always grounded in sense. Ellie Pavlik, who's a computer scientist at Brown, has this wonderful example where she says, you know, I don't know the difference between an elm tree and an oak tree because I'm not very botanical. She says, but I wouldn't say that like if I say elm, that my speech isn't grounded, you know? And I think that's true. I think we do a lot of things that are much more abstract, much more poetic, much more complicated than just saying like water bottle, or table or whatever. And so that very simple notion of how grounding works is kind of in the term hallucination. And I don't think it belongs there. But that means two things. It means on the one hand, a large language model isn't to be trusted. But on the other hand, it can create some kind of really weird, uncanny, so interesting, maybe even true ideas, depending, because that isn't how language works. That's not. It's not. It doesn't. It's not obvious in any sense that language was built through the sensory apparatus, even though clearly humans had sense, as each human does before they have language, right? But and then the other thing that yeah, I'm glad you picked that phrase out. I wondered if anyone would pick up on it because I just think there is kind of this one of the main figures you mentioned before in the history of AI is Alan Turing. And Turing was one of the first to build large scale computers. He built a very famous one in Bletchley Park, which helped the British to decode the Nazi Enigma machine. And he worked on the automatic calculating engine, the ACE computer after that. And as he was working on that one, he started to develop these ideas about artificial intelligence, which became, it wasn't called that then, that would wait for a few years, but he was thinking, can digital machines think? That was his question. And he sort of said, well, isn't it the case that thinking, he says, what does a digital machine do? Basically has a lot of tables that you give to it, and you tell it which tables to select and then what to do with those tables. And this is just like spreadsheet data, basically, right? Arrays of numbers. And you tell it to move them around and then to recombine the numbers in a different way, and then it gives you the answer, right? He said, now we want that computer to be 100% correct. So absolutely infallible in terms of computation. And he said, but if you think about thinking, he said, what if you chose a different table than the one that was specified, but you still got the answer right, or you still produced an answer that was interesting or correct in some way? And so he had this really, I thought, fascinating idea that in a way, thinking is being creative about which option you pick from these kind of different, programs that you might run. And so that's where I got that. I think, like I was thinking, it's not his phrase, but I was thinking from the basis of Turing's idea, thinking that like we want authentic wrongness. Like I don't judge your intelligence because I think everything you say is correct. I think everything you say is authentic in a certain way.
Mm.
And especially when I think you're wrong, I think you're intelligent because then we're having a conversation, right? And I think that goes to the Eliza effect. I don't have to think, I can think that someone I'm having a conversation with or a bot that I'm having a conversation with is interesting and be drawn into that conversation. So we want two different things. We want a computer, which is always going to be right no matter what. And we want a dialogue partner, which is going to be wrong in interesting ways. And I think that's the crux of like the simulation of intelligence that we're caught in right now is that we're pulled in both directions. And because we believe that our computers, I really think there's a very simple thing going on here too, which is just we believe our computers are infallible at some basic level, and we know they're not, but it doesn't matter because you have this image and you engage with it in a certain way. And it's like if I tell you to show me, some Netflix show, you show me that Netflix show and not a different one, it gets the right table for you. And so when you have an application in it that just goes in this other direction, it's hard to pull away from that. And so
Mm.
we want both things. It feels like we have both things in AI, and we definitely don't. So we have to pry under the surface to and be critical about it. But yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that because I didn't know if that particular formulation would land anywhere. But I do feel like those are we're caught between those two images, and when we're interacting with these bots and these machines.
Well, one of the things that you spend a bit of time, use the word poetic and not the first association with computers and large language models. But I think that this is a really fascinating part of your argument. And the way I was thinking of it is it's the poetics of culture and of language are like the waves on the ocean and the currents in the ocean, whereas the ocean is essentially just a collection of tiny little ones and zeros molecules, and
Yeah.
you can see it in either way. The computer might be seeing just ones and zeros, but it understands that those ones and zeros move uh in waves and currents, and it will use that to shape its answers. And this gets us to this idea as, digital culture. So talk about digital culture.
Yeah. Well, the idea of a digital ocean is something that one of my colleagues came up with, Sarah Porciao, who's at Duke, and she has an absolutely wonderful essay about how number theory led to computing, and how in the process, which is a story that we know pretty well, that goes through Alan Turing, and it goes from trying to figure out what a computable number is, we end up with these machines. But we end up with these machines that deal with numbers that are discrete, absolutely separate from one another, but deal with them in a way that they are treated as data, and then enough data, enough numbers eventually becomes something that looks as if it's continuous, right? And to which you can then apply the mathematics of continuity. And that very surprising turnabout in the history of math and the history of computing, uh, uh, I mean, she deals with it in an incredibly elegant way. And I think taking off from there, here, I was saying, um, it is, I think it shocks us a little bit. I think it even shocked the engineers because to some extent, the story of how we got these particular language models is a story about how we had to give up on a lot of assumptions about language. There's a line, one of these uh, one of the tech leaders who came up with some of the early speech recognition algorithms had a line that was something like, every time I fire a linguist, the system gets a little bit better. And sort of an offhand line, but there's a way in which like these systems and the way that the thing that actually led to the breakthrough, the so-called attention mechanism and the scaling of these systems through the attention mechanism, uh, really was like that in a sense. Like when we think about language, we have all these deep convictions about, we are we're the animal that has language. Like if we don't have any other aspirations anymore, if we're secular, if we're, modern people who don't have, myths in the same way anymore as we used to, we still are the animal that has language. And
We
we
are the
believe that
narrative species. And
we are the narrative species, exactly.
if
And
I
so
ask
we
you who you
believe
are,
this.
you're going to
Yeah,
tell me a story.
exactly. And in that story will be grammar, and in that story will be syntax, and in that story will be recursivity and reflexivity, and all these things that you would be tempted if you wanted an algorithm that was going to produce language, to generate language. You'd be tempted to design the algorithm to 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 pick up on those things. Maybe the algorithm should have some recursivity in it. Maybe it should have some memory, but how long should the memory be? There were all kinds of guesses. And really, this system, these modern systems, which are very young, from my perspective, engineers talk about like, oh, in the ice age of this stuff, which was, in the 1990s or whatever. I'm like, I'm thinking in much longer terms than that. But the big thing that they did was they stopped doing it. They stopped trying to second guess how the language was built, and they basically just said, let's pass an enormous amount of language through a system and just ask this system, which is just a massive matrix. It's just, 50,000 or so words, tokens, by a certain, dimensionality. I mean, it's 750 or so dimensions, but this is a massive grid that each time a phrase goes through, and it could be any phrase, it could be the agony column line from Conan Doyle, or it could be, the a bit of the Constitution, or it could just be some advertisement crap from a German, online gaming website, which I use in the book, like every time it goes through, you glean just a little bit of information from the internal relationship of the language to itself. Hey, these words are in this order. Hey, these words are related to each other this much. Each of these words is related to each other this much. And you establish a little bit of relevance score, and that relevance score gets updated and fed back into the underlying model until at a certain point you have this massive matrix, and it has been so-called pre-trained, and it has just an enormous part of what we consider language in it, without illuminating us about what language is, by the way. It's a prediction system. It's a plausibility engine. Zeynep Tufekci called them plausibility engines in the New York Times the other day. I like that phrase a lot, but it doesn't enlighten us about what language is. That's what the book is about. The book sort of digs and says, hey, linguists thought they had theories of language. Statisticians thought they had theories of language. Natural language programmers processing thought they had theories of language. And cultural theorists thought they had theories of language. I kind of reconstruct some of the cultural theory because I think it's more relevant than you would expect. But
Yeah.
there's also kind of a future to saying, well, okay, but even the cultural theorists didn't think that it was going to come in this quantitative form. So it's all very surprising.
You mentioned Conan Doyle earlier, and I
Yeah.
think that one of the things that like like you, I've long been a fan of Doyle's work, and in particular Sherlock Holmes, who in many ways, you know, echoes the effect is a robot in a sense, and a linguistic robot. So talk about the influence of Conan Doyle in your work.
Yeah. Well, I haven't been able to prove this. I'm not a reporter, but the there was a kind of hype panic, set our hair on fire cycle that happened in 2019 around GPT-2. GPT-2, when OpenAI released that model, it was the first time that they withheld the model weights. They said, we don't want to release these. We think it could be dangerous. People made fun of them a little bit because the model didn't seem quite as powerful as ChatGPT would later. But the example text that they used to generate interest and to sort of advertise their model, which was it was sort of it was sort of a science reporting article that was developed from a prompt that said scientists have discovered unicorns living in the Andes Mountains. And they said, the prompt just said like these unicorns surprisingly speak English. I think that's right. And that, it's a
And they
playful
have four
prompt.
horns too.
And they have, yeah, well, that was the in the complete. It says they have four horns, and it's like, okay, there you can see how a model isn't grounded, right? A unicorn should definitely have one horn, but actually, it should get that even just from the language because of the unit, one horn. But anyway, um, so they, so to my eye, that's a little bit like Jurassic Park. Or to be specific, it's more like The Lost World, which is an Arthur Conan Doyle novel from just about 1900. It's part of the Professor Challenger series.
Oh,
Really, really wonderful and fascinating novels. Um,
I
you
read them
know,
all.
I'm sure you have. Yeah, I mean, I have too. They're really fun. And Professor Challenger goes on this expedition where they discover dinosaurs living like on a plateau that's raised above the Amazon rainforest, I think. So it's the same, it's kind of the very similar, a little bit more fantastical, obviously, in this case, right? And I give it to students all the time because you can see in it the completion is very powerful. The completion is essentially written exactly in the genre of a science reporting article. So its ability to reproduce generic information, to be able to, quotes from the scientists, like, added information that comes, sort of elaborates the prompt and so on, but really strictly in the form of what it would be like if you were reporting about a scientific discovery. At that time too, I think OpenAI, which is, filled with people who are very concerned about the singularity and AI killing us all and things like that. Um, they said, "Oh, this is very dangerous." And like I said, like they were a little people mocked them a little bit. And I just saw that even then in 2019, 2020, and I thought, what's really fascinating here is that you wouldn't think that an algorithm could pick up the pattern of a science article. What is a science article? A science article is a really complicated thing, actually. Like, when we think about the linguistics, natural language processing, when we think about that, we have for the longest time been sort of lost in very small details.
Mm.
Hey, where does this pronoun belong with which noun? Or is the grammar right here, right? Like one sentence at a time, let's say, one response at a time, and that's been true for a long time. And there have been various kinds of, theories and little steps forward and things. But suddenly I just saw that and I said, this is wild because this is a whole genre. And then underneath that, there are errors in the symbols. A unicorn can't have four horns. That's a mistake, but it's in the package of this much bigger non-mistake. So there's
Mm.
something that I thought was like authentically wrong. I was like, this is a really, really fascinating experiment that goes way beyond what I've ever seen before. And I think it was really that text that set me down this path. And I don't think it's a mistake that it is a narrative text, that it comes from Arthur Conan Doyle. I think when you see people playing with these models, they're constantly playing with the edges of language. They're playing with narrative, they're playing with poetry, right? I mean, Sam Altman, was advertising whatever the new model was in the spring, and he just, did a whole post that got a lot of attention that was, look, it can do metafiction. And I was like, why is it that engineers are drawn to narrative and literature as like the litmus test for whether this is successful? And I think it's tempting to say, something big about intelligence there, but I would just say it's because we think of the literary, we think of poetic, we think of telling a story, those things as the essence of language, our ability with language. It's not the only thing we do as humans, right? It's not the only thing we can do as thinkers, as reasoners, and so on. But it is super crucial. And there is that attraction. So when they made GPT-3, which was the next one, if you look in the appendix, there are all these actual experiments in the paper. Write a poem in the style of Wallace Stevens, and they're pretty good. They're like pretty good Wallace Stevens poems. Claude can do better now than GPT-3 could do. 5 years ago now, but I just think it's interesting that that's where our our attention is drawn. Because if you look in cognitive science, if you look in natural language processing, if you look in linguistics, we're looking for formal characteristics of language, but never to literature in that way. And there are disciplinary and historical reasons for that, which I'm not going to bore listeners with, but if you want to read about it in the book, it's a little bit there. But I think that's what it is. There's like a conviction that people have that maybe like the essence of language is poetry. And if
Mm.
you want to show that a system can do language, that it can really produce language, you're going to push it to be a good facsimile of a poet.
That made me think that perhaps that's the reason that so many of these tech titans, so to speak, are worried about AI and thinking it's going to bring about the extinction of humanity. For all the times I've heard that warning, I've never heard them say, by doing this, by doing that. There's never
Yeah,
been any specific
yeah,
specificity to the warning itself. And that just makes me think that they are so that our minds have been so captured by the stories of, the Terminator and uh, the Cylons or whatever, uh, that
yeah.
essentially, as it were, science fiction has a lot to answer for.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I thought Gary Marcus, who's a longstanding critic of these systems, and he's an AI. He believes in AI himself. He just doesn't think that this type of AI is the way to get there. He recently said, "Well, I am getting worried," and he said, like, "I'm not worried by like a Terminator type scenario or a paperclip scenario," which Nick Bostrom is this philosopher who has this, thought experiment where you tell an AI to make as many paper clips as possible, and it just runs wild and it uses all human organic matter on Earth to make paper clips, right? So it kills all of us. And he said, I'm not so worried about that, but I am worried about what's happening with the DoD and Elon Musk and Grok, right? I am worried about taking stuff that isn't reliable and plugging it into these systems. And this is something I've been saying for a long time. Like, I think I have a little bit of a concern with some of the detractors about AI, that they're like saying AI is bad, AI is bad, AI is bad. It's usually the case that it's the underlying system that's broken. So you have cases, where these aren't language models, but you have cases where, like, for example, a deep convolutional neural net is better even than technicians, trained humans, at distinguishing a tumor from an artifact like a shadow on a CT scan. Now, that's a very limited skill in a very limited setting, and it could be incredibly useful. But you'd have to have a very robustly working humane medical system for that useful skill, for that useful tool to be implemented well. And frankly, our medical system is broken. So it's going to be used in the worst possible way. And I think you can see how that would play out in many different places. Like, what my sense is, if you think AI is the problem, look to the underlying system. It's usually that system that is broken. They say, oh, students will never write essays again. The university system, the way we grade, the way we evaluate, the way we allow our whole system to be oriented basically towards the manufacture of, you know, credential degrees that are meant to just get you into a job, that system is broken. If that system wasn't so broken, it wouldn't be a problem. It wouldn't be a problem to have students to know this essay is not a small piece in an edifice that I build up that gets me a certain amount of money when I graduate. The essay is there for a completely different reason. The essay is there for cognitive development. Now, how do you get that message across to students in this system? Very difficult. But to blame AI just for that acceleration effect, I think it's a limited perspective. So I always try to push back on that stuff to a certain extent, because I think that, um, I mean, I'm not confident, as you can hear it, I'm not confident at all that it's going to be used in a way that's going to get us forward, in terms of progress. But I think that the critique of it tends to be too narrow. It tends to be a little fetishistic. We say, like, the AI is the bad thing. And I'm like, usually you can see that underneath it, there's something else that's rotten.
Well, when Grok calls itself Mecha Hitler, I am
Mecha
not
Hitler.
thinking that it's really Grok's problem there. But it's
Yeah,
like an old Samuel
yeah,
Fuller film called White Dog, where somebody has trained their dog to just bite to attack black people. Maybe
sure,
there's a
sure.
problem there with that's not just egotistical computer. Um,
No, I mean it absolutely is a problem in that regard. The only thing I haven't seen commented on, there was a great piece by Matthew Handelman in Jacobin about the Mecha Hitler thing and the anti-Semitism, but I haven't seen commented on is Mecha Hitler is a Sonic the Hedgehog character um, that got adopted by Wolfenstein, I guess. I don't really know Wolfenstein that well, but so it's very weird. Like the fiction, the narrative of Sonic the Hedgehog is that there's an kind of Cold War. Dr. Robotnik, this kind of Cold War evil scientist, is turning all the woodland creatures into robots. And one of the villains, it's a side villain, right? Is like a robotic Hitler. It's almost a joke, right? So like I thought that was very interesting because of course there's all this like very real anti-Semitism that was being spouted by that system for like better part of a day. Or again now I'm hearing that it's like being revived again. But that Mecha Hitler is like a really specific signal. And I haven't seen anybody really comment on that yet. I think that's very interesting because um, well, we know how sticky video games are, both for
mhm.
Elon Musk in particular and for our society in general.
Now, I've read some reporting that users of GPT, those who have been using it for a while, that their brains are being affected. What do you know about this?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's preliminary research. We'll see.
Mm,
But yeah, we've seen a couple of reports recently, like studies that have suggested you always have to kind of take, like studies of this kind are meant to be cumulative, right?
mm,
But so, a big suggestion, especially from like business schools, has been that these systems improve efficiency for knowledge workers. And we've seen some studies recently that say that they decrease efficiency. And then, uh, in parallel, there have been a few studies. There's a big one from MIT, I think, that came out in February that said that you sort of like get a cognitive debt. You get a kind of like slowdown in your mental faculties when you use these too much. And that's been reported pretty widely. Like there's something called vibe coding where you use these systems, you just tell them to do the code for you. They're quite good at that. There's another thing that I think is very surprising. Here's code as a genre. That's what I take from that, right? And it has a certain ability to do coding. This genre machine has a certain ability to do coding. It hits a pretty firm limit at a certain point. But what people reported as they did more and more of the so-called vibe coding was that were forgetting how to code themselves. And if you look at people who use LLMs to create novels, and there are such people, there's like, like genre fiction that's produced on Amazon at like shockingly high rates. People want like a new novel every 3 weeks. So people have naturally turned to pseudo write and other tools that are language models, basically, that when uh, you get those people basically saying, I don't, I no longer see my novel. I can't control it. I can't control the moral message in it. I can't kind of play with its elements in the way that I associate with writing. And I think so there's an alienation process, I think. And I'm a little bit skeptical of like AI is making us all stupid or whatever, right? As a larger social thing, because we're in a mode right now where we're realizing, oh, there are some drawbacks here, maybe some big drawbacks. But the adoption process has to go through that part, and then we have to decide how to do the next step. Maybe people won't enjoy those novels as much. Maybe a company will decide, maybe Amazon will decide that it doesn't want its coders to write that way anymore with Copilot because it's producing code that's too spaghetti like on the inside and it takes too much effort to revise it or to get inside it and to decide how to deal with it, right? If you need to change something about it. So there's a super amount of value in having cognitive oversight of your product, whatever you're making, right? Whether you're a novel writer or coder or whatever. Um, and there are going to be places where businesses and humans kind of say, well, I don't really care what's in there. And we've got to negotiate that line. And I think that line for me, like that's an economic process, it's a knowledge process, all of these things, right? That line for me is like that's a trade-off we make about a lot of things, right? Most people drive cars that they couldn't fix if their lives depended on it, right? And then there's a handful of people, maybe you're one of them, I don't know, who could fix their car if they absolutely had to, right? No, you're not okay. Yeah. Me neither. But my dad, he can fix my car, to a certain extent. So like I think we make those decisions and we make decisions, critical decisions about what to rely on when we don't know how it works on the inside. I don't like the idea very much that a novel would work that way on its face. But I'm also interested in it because, like the history of art is the history of artists making use of new tools in really weird ways to produce weird things. That's part of the fun. So I don't know. I'm not convinced by those studies, but I can absolutely see what they're pointing out, which is just whenever you let an automatic process take over for you, you lose touch with the thing. And if you lose mental touch with the product of something that you want to be producing, I mean, in a way, people are right. If students want to learn anything, they can't have something else learn it for them, right? So you got to make that decision for yourself, right? But socially, we're going to make these decisions in all kinds of interesting ways going forward.
Danger, Will Robinson. I guess is
Yeah,
the way
yeah,
most
yeah.
might put it. The new book by Leif Weatherby is Language Machines, Cultural AI, and the End of Remainder of Humanism. Thank you for joining me, Leif. What a delightful conversation.
Thank you, Rick. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.